realise some of the things that actually are in it. And it's like the GMS doctors actually pressure to work with those that were specific and pressure to apply obligation. It's important to know where to go and look for all of this information. So I just wanted to mention the eGMS resource, which is on the SGP website, and it is an invaluable resource. It's a very useful resource. Primary care reimbursement service and clinical consulting can answer a lot of questions about it, and there are loads more topics for most of you to probably just write questions with regard to this. Loads more topics for that, a number of claims and organizations. Knowing your GMS panel is the start of knowing how to handle GMS claims in practice. And I can't stress the importance of knowing your panel and knowing your lab. We'll look at a couple of important aspects of this, but one would be making sure that you actually know who's on your panel, first and foremost. And that sounds so simple, but actually it's not as easy as it might seem. You're going to have practice software that will download your full blue book or your actual panel listing. You probably already know what they look like. If you were to print them out, they look like this. And all of your patients are listed inside, and it will tell you all about their demographics, their age, where they live, and so on. And there's a few things to watch out for. Newborn babies, we never were able to add them until recently, now you can add them. So it's important to add the newborn babies to your panel. It's important to remove deceased patients, because if you don't, then they will be recruited to your point. Private residents in nursing homes, we look at the fees we get for those, but it's very important to make sure that again they're properly coded on your GMS list. And it's important to keep an eye out as well for patients who not just are on your list, but aren't on your list. And in particular, I suppose this is where it gets head down in terms of temporary visitors to our practice. And the HSC have recently moved to general practice essential. They don't intend to pay for patients who are temporary for 3 months. Now that's always been the contract, but it hasn't been enforced until recently. So I think it's important to be important to aware of the contract and some of the surprises. And I suppose there's another one as well, patients who turn 16 before 15. It's not written on their card, it's not written in their letters, but cards will spiral cash on people who work here. It's important to be aware of that. To let your patients know, because education is the best way forward. Sorry, I realised there's a few extra people can really hear me down the back. That's great. As I said, your software might actually tell you to download the blue book for you, but that won't highlight those areas where patients have not been correctly coded by the HC. So apart from just doing maybe your PCRS and board, which your practice software can do, and it's just a screenshot from Socrates, but I do think it's really important to look at those blue books. So I've just included here that you can see the code there is under PC. There, so it's 903 or 906, and that's for nursing home patients. And it's really important to make sure they're properly coded. If they're not, then we can actually do something about it, because we can go to your panel updates and affect everything is coded there. When you leave a nursing home, just in case the patients in nursing home is great to get the nursing home to vouch for the fact that you're changing the code. So if you're finding yourself frustrated, thwarted by changing the code and finding that it's not been updated next month when you're blue book, you need to contact the nursing home and tell them, you know, to expect a letter from PCRS if they need to return that letter. It's really important. So let's look very briefly at the different types of fees that are available through the GMS. You'll all be well familiar with these. If you don't have pay scales, they're available on taxmanager.ie, but we'll run through some of the main ones now. Apart from the capitation payment, you'll be familiar with the $8 payments, temporary emergency visitor patients. There's fee per item for e cards and that sort of thing. Again, it's all outlined in the presentation notes that you have, so I won't dwell on it. Special services, the codes A, B, C, and so on that we fill into our little STCs. And those of you who will truly familiar with the STC books that we get, the green forms, and they are worth quite a lot of money, so make sure that you fill them in, make sure they're signed, make sure that you store them, because the HC will audit them from time to time, and they are quite lucrative, I suppose, when they add up. And the out of hours in particular, you need to be very cautious with, because again, the HC are now auditing them, and they are assessing them to see whether they're valid or correspondence. Let me know as well, I suppose anyone who has been going through flu claims in the last month or two will be well aware of the new claiming portal for the vaccinations. And again, it's just as useful to see what the fees actually payable for those vaccinations are. They're still quite significant, and more than our colleagues in the pharmacy get for the same administer the same shot. So definitely still worthwhile and something that we should be cautious of. It's also interesting to note that they're now allowing us to see in advance if a patient has already claimed for flu. I think that is a useful tool. So some tips on practice support. Practice support is an area that creates an awful lot of confusion in my experience. I get loads of queries on practice support. So the first thing is, if you wish to avail practice support, you need to have a GMS PAL minimum of 100 patients. And the claims are based on then after that initial qualifying period of having 100 patients on your actual panel. Then your patients are actually categorised according to their age, and if they're over 70, then they get a weighting of 3:1. So this weighted panel is taken into consideration for how much you actually get for practice support. Apart from the weighted panel, you also have to take into consideration the actual grade of the staff, so whether it's a nurse, whether it's a practice manager, whether it's a secretary, and the length of time that they have working in your practice. It's a very complicated algorithm to work out how much practice support you're due, especially because employers' PRSI is also factored into the equation, so it's extremely difficult to figure out exactly what you should get because it's based on last year's PRSI returns. But let's take a simple example, and it really is the most simple example. We'll take two doctors, Dr. Black and Dr. White, and their weighted panels add up to 2,400. So we'll divide that by 1,200, which is the maximum weighted panel that can be taken into consideration, multiplied by 40 for the hours that can be claimed, and we know that there's a maximum of 80 hours to be claimed in this practice. For nurses, unfortunately, Nurse A and Nurse B do work full-time, so the total number of hours that will be claimed is 80. So in this practice, they're claiming a maximum number of hours. The maximum nurse subsidy per annum is €38,204, and therefore the monthly subsidy, when you add it up, is €6,367, which then gets divided back into the ratio of 1,400:1,000 in order to be paid back to the GMS doctors pro rata for the number of patients on their panel. So it's, even from that simple example, you can see it's not as simple as you might hope. And Dr. Black will get a greater payment than Dr. White, even though when you add them together, the nurses are claiming their full subsidy. So the total rates, as you can see, it actually goes a very long way. If you can manage to claim the full subsidy, it can go a long way towards paying for practice nurses, practice managers, and secretaries. The practice manager scale is based on 0.1 of the nursing scale, and effectively what happens if you don't have enough nurses to claim, you can then claim for practice manager. So if you have 2 GPs, you can claim for 2 nurses. If you have 3 GPs and you've 2 nurses, you can also claim practice manager. And it is possible to claim more than one practice manager for a practice. So anyone who's only claiming one practice manager, if you have unused hours, think about whether you might want to avail of those in terms of a second practice manager. Yeah.
You said Dr. Black had 1,400 and Dr. White had 1,000. You made both of them 1,200.
Well, what happens in group practice is they'll be added together, and then when you get them back, they'll be redistributed back to the original.
So you don't have to readjust the base size to maximise.
Not for, no, although it depends really as to how you break up your interest at the end, because on the blue books, you'll have so many patients, and then on the pink sheets, when you get them back, sorry, not the blue books, pink sheets, it's all very jargon, isn't it? Your patient panel that you have will entitle you to a certain amount of payment back. So in that case, the total payment was based on the aggregate panel, but then it was redistributed to Dr. Black and Dr. White based on what their actual panels are. So if in your practice, doctors take home what's on their big sheet, then it will make a difference to you. Whereas if your GPs pool the income and then maybe each make a monthly drawing based on the number of sessions they do or something factor like that, which would be more common, I think. But it can have to be like...
There isn't a need to redistribute panels.
No, if you pool the income for practice and redistribute it then on your own basis, there's no need to worry about it.
You need to notify the GMS though that if you take on somebody else, that just send in a letter signed by the doctors that we are happy to allow vacant panels for practice service subsidy with the grants.
Yeah. So, yeah, practice support is extremely complicated. point add up to what you think is correct, and I would say the PCRS are really good. The one part that's particularly tricky to try and figure out is the PRSI formula, and I can give you the full algorithm if you want, but it is quite extraordinarily complex. If they're approaching that maximum salary, then I think the chances are it's the PRSI band that's affecting you. And check with your basics for your employees, check with your accountant in terms of who's on top of your PRSI band, or check your payroll systems of who's on top of your PRSI. And if you've only one panel, yes. If you've one panel, you may only have enough hours for one, or you may only have enough hours for a partial one, depending on the size of your panel.
But if you're using there's no hours at all.
Well, you can same practice manager or practice nurse, depending on what you want to do, but it'd be more lucrative than those practices than a nurse once you've had experience. So if you only have a limited number of hours, then you'd be better off to put your nurse on the subsidy.
You can't claim practice manager for a single-handed practice.
Not if you have a nurse, no.
No, even if you don't have a nurse,
Yeah.
you can't anymore claim for a single-handed practice for a practice manager. You used to be able to, but that changed about 7 or 8 years ago.
So your practice support is definitely one of the most complicated areas. But I think one of the interesting things is that I have seen, that they have allowed more than one practice manager in the practice, which is quite a departure. And not just in practices where there have been amalgamations of practices, but actually in practices simply say that we're now opening extending hours. Our practice manager used to work 3 days. We've appointed a second practice manager to work an extra 3 days now. And a break subsidy to do, because it's calculated in terms of hours rather than in terms of people. So you can have 2 job shares and paying some of the hours for one, some of the hours for another. So it's not really just about the people, it's really about the hours. So you're paying for a maximum number of hours, which cannot exceed 40 in any event. So leave claims then. As you know, there's different sets of leave available for JMS doctors. There's annual leave, study leave, sick leave, maternity leave, and adoptive leave. The maximum amount payable per day is €213.12. And there's a number of forms which we would need to submit. So again, I won't labour this point because there's quite an extensive amount of information to take home in terms of the handouts there, but if anyone has difficulty reading or anything, please give me a call. Sick leave allows based on a 4-year rolling period, so if someone is sick for an extended period of time, it will affect them over a longer term basis. For panels between 1 and 700, full capitation is paid for the first 6 months and half then for the second 6 months, and a locum is based on the doctor's capitation fee. And this again can take a little bit of time to work out, but basically you take the doctor's JMS capitation and then divide it by the number of days in a month and multiply by the number of leave days taken. So it's proportionate both to the panel and to the length of time that the doctor was out sick. For panels over 700, then you guarantee the maximum payment for the locum 230 hours, which also has to go. Annual leave is also based on panel size. It depends on how many patients are in your panel as to how many annual leave days you can qualify for, up to a maximum of 35, which would be for a very sensible list of 1,500 or more. Study leave, same rules apply, but minimum numbers of 100 on your panel to qualify for study leave. But study leave then is more across the board. You get 10 days, and it's all calculated in terms of half-day sessions. It's very important to include the certificate of attendance along with the thing because it won't be processed. And I think it's worth pointing out as well, you must be careful about Saturdays because we won't always cover Saturdays depending on the situation. Medical indemnity refund, again, hopefully you all claim this for your practice, but if not, I think it's something important to be aware of. Medical defence can be quite expensive. You're talking about NGU, you're talking about €11,520 for a GP for the year, and if you can claim 95% of the net cost of that practice, I certainly would. The number of patients on your panel affects the amount of the reimbursement you can receive, and it can go to, as I said, 95% for rural practice, large GPs, and for, again, GPs at large panels. So, sure to bring it back. An interesting departure is that this year the National Contracts Office in Paterberg have said that GPs must provide certificates with full-time sessions, even if they do not work full-time. And I think that's something to be aware of, because if you're lucky enough to go away with playing a part-time doctor in 2012, you certainly won't in 2013. And it may be more valuable to you to pay the higher rate of sessions and to pay back than it would to pay the lesser indemnity, and there's also query over whether or not your doctor is properly identified if they aren't at that. 9 plus sessions for MPS, 14 plus sessions is their highest plan, so you don't actually need to pay 14 plus sessions, but if you pay 9 plus sessions for MPS, and I think the maximum for MD is 7 plus sessions, there's no higher pay grade than that. So. Other GMS payments that you can consider in your practice would be methadone treatment protocol, which is quite valuable. Can be up to €176 and 43 cents per patient per month, and again, depending how you manage that in your practice, it can be quite a lucrative option for you. Health Amendment Act, it's important to put whether it's domiciliary or in the practice. Asylum seeker registration fee probably isn't as frequent now because Ireland is a less desirable place for asylum seekers to come to, but some of the practices might still run Heartwatch, which is possibly dying out in some parts of the country at this stage. And in some parts of the country, but not nationwide, is the contraceptive services contract, which again I think imagine will probably die out in the future when it's replaced, but it's still there for now. And there's a number of one-off grants which you might or might not have claimed for your practice, and it's definitely worth pursuing these if you haven't already claimed them. So there's a nurse startup grant for the first nurse employed in each GMS practice. That can be up to €3,809. I would stress that different parts of the country, different local health offices can be quite different to how they approach things. So do check with your local health office because some of them seem to be quite fine with giving out this grant and others not so. But to the best of my knowledge, it's still available in most parts of the country. So check with your local health office because these things should be standard nationwide, but certainly in Wicklow it's still available. The fridge grant, again, this is originally comes from the child immunisations contract, and a fridge can be bought by your practice for a value of up to €1,270, and you just provide a receipt for the fridge to the local health office and they reimburse you. For each doctor entering a GMS contract, there is a grant as well for computerisation, so if you have computer equipment purchased for your surgery, you can claim that back again through your local health office. And it's important to note that most of them are per practice, but this is for a GMS doctor. So if you have a GMS doctor who's joined your practice more recently, check and make sure you really have claimed the grant for them, because it's possible that more recent doctors, even if your original doctors did claim it back in the 1980s or 90s or whenever you bought your first computer, it's possible that more recent additions, and now that the GMS is opening up to more and more doctors, there's going to be new people coming on stream who can claim this grant.
I think it's merely that I don't know the place in the country. I think that's a thing in the past. Definitely HSE, the southeast, but I think all of the HSE south is a no-no.
Yeah, well certainly in Wicklow they're still paying it. So check with your local health offices. So it's a shame that these things ought to be national and ought to be, but for us anyway we're still able to claim them. So I think it's worth checking out. Unfortunately I don't work for HSE, so I can't promise you what your area will do. And I
You can definitely claim the immunisation grants.
Yeah, they're still around. A lot of them are still around, and I think it depends on your area. So ask the worst they can say is no. So then in terms of maximising your claims, definitely make sure to claim STCs for all of your temporary visitors, all EE cards, all NHS visitors, for every out of hours, every valid out of hours claim, and also for every special service which your practice provide. Altering those STCs can be a little harder than you would think. But if you can manage to check by your appointment system, for example, all of the Moraine appointments or all of your out-of-hours appointments. So use your practice IT reporting system to pull the best list you can of all patients who should have had STCs completed. Obviously, the bigger the practice, the more cumbersome this task is, but it really is worth auditing because I can find €1,000 worth of extra STCs at the end of the month in my practice on the client GPs. It's so simple to forget one or two weeks, one or two mislay one on the desk. And particularly with the online training, there is only a certain length of time which you can actually put through STC before the system will reject it. So I do think it's worth auditing and making sure that you're training in a timely fashion. And then when the returns come back to you as well, of course, you need to make sure that you have been paid for each of those claims. So again, you should know how many out-of-hours claims you sent off, how many Marina claims you sent off, how many other claims you sent off that converts suture in that thing. And I think if you keep an eye on those, then you will find out that you're making the very best use you possibly can from GMS. So those would be the top tips in terms of maximising the claims, making sure you're not missing anything, making sure you're not working for no return. We look at maternity fees. Again, this can be quite significant. For a second or subsequent pregnancy, you can be paying almost €300. Now, I know that's not a lot as far as you want to have to divide it out for consultation. It may not seem like a lot, but a lot of patients don't actually attend all their visits, and if you can encourage them to come and avail of their visits, it might actually be quite worthwhile for us. If you have any supplementary visits, please make sure to actually tell them as such and the reason why it's an additional visit, because we will not be paid on this too. Yeah. Yeah. And you can tell. Pardon? You can, yeah, but you have to explain why. So, for example, you need to kind of there was hypertension or preeclampsia or whatever the medical reason was to claim them, and you can claim additional visits on top of the normal number provided there's a reason and a reason why. So with the claim, you probably will get paid for it properly noted and notify them that it's a special visit. And if you print out your report, your practice report, they'll probably actually tell you that it's a special visit. Ours will be separation room with Socrates, and the extra visits are printed additionally as a separate kind of function on the regular visits. So yeah, they can be quite lucrative when you add them up. So just make sure you're not missing them. Make sure that again you're not missing them from your practice IT in terms of getting Socrates. I'll show you a screenshot in a moment. But it has an antenatal reporting section, and if your doctor just enters free checks but doesn't mark up as antenatal visit, it's easy to miss, and that's money that's lost. So again, just check them all, and whoever's sending off the MSC report at the end back to the local health office, worth to just take a scan through the file and check how many visits have been missed, because you're surprised how much money you can come. And also to identify any patients who, for one reason or another, don't complete their 6-week check, because often the trigger for your claim is your 6-week check. And if for some reason the patient doesn't have a 6-week check, it's all too easy for that match card to sit in a box somewhere and not be claimed. And really, that's just again money down the drain. So it would be a shame to see that happen. So what we would do is every month we would look for people whose EDDs have passed 2 months ago, because they should have had their 6-week check. And if they haven't had their 6-week check, we should be calling and inviting them into the 6-week check before it gets too late. And if they don't want it, or if for whatever reason the pregnancy didn't end, within the 6-week check, then I think it's important to submit that claim as well. And from this card, it's not such a situation, it's important to send off that MAC card and claim for the visits that have been completed. The child is covered for a 2-week and a 6-week check, and the mother is covered for the 6-week check. And any other visits, anything else. So if it's a GMS patient, you want to make sure that you add the baby to your panel, and you also want to tell the mother or parent or guardian, whatever, that they need to register the child with PCRS by submitting the PPS number and the birth certificate. And then you find that they stay on your panel and you should be getting your capitation payment for them. But you've no one to blame but yourself if they don't join the panel, nowadays, because we have the option of adding them, just like we have the option of updating the nursing home people. So in a way, it's more trouble for us, but in a way, it's actually enabling us to get the payments that we've always been due. So we just have to be careful to do it, and to do it in a timely fashion, because they will recoup payment for bereavements, but they won't backdate much for us, So do it in a timely fashion. That's just a screenshot from Socrates, and you can see there the pregnancy and the different visits. And there's a little box for each visit for you to take to say it's a special visit. And it's quite useful.
Sorry, how many visits are you actually allowed for maternity leave? How many is it?
It is a first pregnancy, I think it's 6, and the subsequent is 7.
Okay, and what would be the next extra visits then?
Extra visits would be, for example, if you've got hypertension or various
up to 5 extra.
Yeah. So it's quite a lot, and I think it's quite hard to exceed that maybe. And again, in Socrates, just as an example, but the different practice softwares will all have different reporting modules. But for us, it's particularly handy because if you tick the boxes there, you see here, it says when you're sending off the MAC card, it's completed, when the approval is received, and the claim is sent in, and you can pull a report then. Sorry that the slides don't show that, it's a little fuzzy. But you can pull a report to tell you how many patients are pregnant, how many of those patients have you not sent off MAC card applications for, how many of those patients have you received MAC cards and claimed but not yet got payment. And I think that it's a so simple report. It takes 10 seconds to pull a report. If you keep on top of it, you will make sure that you claim all your maternity payments and claim them properly. So that's maternity. Moving on swiftly, childhood vaccinations. Again, they can be quite lucrative if you complete a full course of immunisations. They're all coded, and if a patient joins late or leaves before they complete their course, you'll find that you have partial payments and a pending pregnancy altogether. So if anyone's in that situation and you want the list of codes, I can give it to you, or you can get it from your local health office. But essentially, if you do follow through the full rigmarole of vaccinations and you manage to hit the 95% uptake from your cohort, then you'll qualify for the special bonus payment at the end of the year. And that can add up to a total of almost €300. So again, practice vaccinations are definitely worth claiming and worth claiming right. The main thing would be the practices tend to miss out on the bonus payment simply by virtue of not telling the local health office if a patient leaves, because they haven't deducted them from their 95% people they have to reach. So again, it's terribly important that you do actually let the health office know, and maybe pull a report quarterly to notify them of patients who have left your cohort, so that you're sure that you will get your immunisation bonus at the end of the year. Okay, so we don't have time to get into everything in intricate detail, but I think it's worth flagging palliative care payments, because not everybody realises that they're there, and certainly not everybody realises that private patients, as much as medical card patients, can be claimed for palliative care. Survival check obviously has become really a staple for lots of practices at this stage, particularly practices with a large female cohort, and €49 and 10 cents per visit is definitely worth carrying out those smears. And the social welfare contract was $8.25 per certificate and $44.44 for detailed report. Again, we could probably spend all day talking about social welfare certs on their own, but I think here I just want to touch on them to make sure that everyone's aware of what they're getting. There's a plethora of other options for people. You can carry out examinations for the guards, you can do legal and insurance work, you can attend court or have standby fees, GP training, clinical director posts, you can have service level agreements, for example, with the ICP for training, you can have company schemes like the important jobs here and there, Garda scheme, or you can work with local employers to try and provide occupational health services. Obviously, we're very touched today upstairs on the private insurance market, and again, that's really quite a lucrative field for practices to consider carrying out minor procedures and things like that. So if you have the resources to do it, it's definitely worth considering.
Sorry, Mary, we brought in somebody to do some minor procedures for us, and it meant 2 visits, one procedure, and I'll come back and review. And what we got just didn't pay to bring someone in, because what you got from the health insurance companies was not what they pay consultants who perform the same procedures. There's a big difference in the rate they pay.
Yes, there is, but I suppose we're a different industry, I suppose, in a consultant.
I was just saying,
you would want to look at maybe
you'd have to look at costs
and decide which ones, which ones will suit your practice and which ones are viable for you to provide. So some of them are definitely quite easy to provide in a general practice setting. Other ones maybe would require an outlay in terms of equipment and work. So maybe just do the ones that you want to provide and claim for those accordingly. So, but definitely there's some options there that maybe of interest to you. And I know today we're seeing lots of people with creative ideas, and I do think that it's worth noting that who knows where this will lead. There's definitely new business models emerging for GPs. I just took the AXA scale, which has just come out for 2013. So this is what AXA are prepared to pay for medical reports in 2013. And that's just one company, and of course you can tell them that you don't like their scale. But I just thought I'd put it up as a kind of an indication of the types of payments that practices can receive for that type of work. And of course there's private income. Competition authority, I don't want them bursting through doors or windows. But I think that it's interesting to see that private income is still very much a staple in most of our practices for keeping the ship afloat. But what has happened more and more in a lot of surgeries is that as the recession bites deeper, we're finding increasing levels of debtors and difficulties in actually receiving the payments that are due. There's a few tips that I suppose are worth noting. One would be have your fee schedule and display it, because people are much less likely to haggle if you've clearly and transparently shown what the fee is going to be in advance. Be consistent. I know in a lot of practices GPs might not like to charge Mrs. O'Brien, who lives around the corner, the same as what he charges somebody who's never seen before. But I think that this leads to great difficulties for practice managers and reception staff and everything else, we're trying to actually get the money. So I think that if you can minimise discretion and maybe try and be consistent in the interest of fairness across other patients, maybe think about if you're not happy charging a fee, maybe think it's not the right fee, then actually you should change the fee. And I know, for example, in our practice we decided to create a new child rate fee in order to maybe consider patients' perspectives that they find it a struggle to pay for things in the current economic climate. So we said, well, fine, we'll actually do something about that. So we put in a reduced rate for children. I'm not saying anyone should, I'm just saying it's an option. And if you have your fee, then stick to it. And it's probably worth more, because we found by doing that, our GPs were much more likely to charge the fee. And we had less, just let it go, or I'll see you because you're with your mom, or this or that. And in actual fact, it didn't make a dip in our practice finances when we decided to decrease the child fee, but to implement it fairly every time. We didn't lose a cent, which was quite startling. But we see a lot of children, a lot of them are reaching for nothing or very little. So I'd rather have a practice policy that everyone can adhere to, rather than having random stuff happening. Again, it makes it a very dissatisfied patient. Why are you charging for Rosie? She was free last time. So, I mean, I can see where the patient is coming from in that equation. I think if you use the practice software, all the practice softwares have excellent recording for invoicing and payments, and I would encourage you to use it, because you don't need to go to any outlay, you know. You already have it in practice. We have a family consultation rate. Yeah, we do. Our fee, I'm telling you now, the rate charge. Our fee in Carlton for our practice manager, the standard adult fee is 50, child rate is 30, and for a family of 2 children and 1 parent, 70. So you can have up to 2 children in the same consultation, 70. But we try to enforce that, because we have had people who come in with child and they say, well, I'm here, you have to go. And they want to pay the €30 and have the adults in, so we don't do that. So that's fine, that's not on family consultation now. So it's 70. Yeah, so for us it's 70, but it's whatever you want. The one thing about private fees is they're entirely at your own discretion, and no one can tell you what's right or what's wrong. So as I said, the competition authority down in like a ton of bricks. So it's entirely at your discretion, but my only advice would be whatever it is, stick to it and let it be clear and let it be fair. And that way you're much less likely to have rows about it afterwards. I do think that anyone who doesn't pay should be followed up, and should be followed up quickly, because the longer a debt is outstanding, the less likely you are to collect it, and the more trouble you'll have to collect it. So one option, if you have a lot of bad debts, I suppose, would be that you could consider a pay on arrival system, which some of the bigger practices have. Loads of practices will think it's a bad idea, and I'm quite happy with that. It's an option. I'm just saying, for people who are really struggling with debts, it's one way of making sure that you tackle it before it becomes a problem. In our practice, we have the option of paying on arrival. We don't force people to pay on arrival, but we have the option of paying on arrival, and loads of people like it for 2 reasons. One, we decided to decrease the fees because we found, because we weren't having so much bad debts, we'd afford to decrease the fees. Secondly, people like it because, I suppose, if they're in a hurry, they come to the desk once, they check in, they pay, and they can walk out the door after this, and there's no trauma. That doesn't mean everyone pays on their way in. Sometimes we don't know what a service is going to cost. Sometimes, you know, for example, someone says, look, I want travel vaccinations, and they haven't discussed what they need. They have to talk to the doctor to find out what they need. So in that event, they come back afterwards. Maybe a patient has been in and is under the impression the doctor's going to see them, or maybe they're coming in to confirm pregnancy and they're not sure if they'll be covered by in April. So there are lots of cases where we don't get money off from coming in the door. There's lots of options where if they say, do you want to pay now or do you want to pay afterwards? A lot of the time they will pay on the way in. And for us, I suppose, because that's our policy, if somebody doesn't want to pay, we find out what's going on before they ever go to the doctor. And if they say, oh look, I forgot my purse, and last week they forgot their purse too, well then it's an opportunity for us to say, you know, that's no problem, take a seat to the practice manager and have a word quietly and say, you know, Rosie, I noticed you were in last week and I had this invoice for you from last week. Is there anything that I can do to make it easier on you, you know? And I think by having a chat early and having a constructive chat and saying, you know, can I help you about it, rather than waiting to be getting a phone call saying you owe me money. But most people really appreciate that, and you can actually offer them help and support if it turns out that they're having a difficulty with paying you. So it's about really maybe offering support rather than just waiting for it to become a problem where you're involved in there now feeling threatened or worried.
What do you think is electronic payments?
Well, I personally think they're a godsend. I mean, it's really terrific because then you can also phone people and say, right,
Is there minimum notifications that need to be using it with what's left or
well,
is it possible?
I suppose you will pay for your terminal rental if you decide to get laser or visa and that sort of thing. You know? So you will pay a fee for your terminal rental. But it can be quite small, and you will also pay a fee then per transaction, a percentage per transaction. But certainly, I think if you're doing any volume of payments at all, it will make sense. Like, I would highly recommend it. And as well as that, you can also then take payment by telephone. So if you do end up phoning Mrs. Jones, who forgot her purse the other day, you can say, well, how are you, Bridie? You know, you were in the other day, and I promised to give you a call to remind you to give the €50 that's outstanding. And do you want me to take it now over the phone? And if she's at home with her purse to the ready, well, why not? Why don't you take it over the phone? It's much easier. I mean, she doesn't have to come back down to the surgery with €50 in cash. So I think by offering choice, you know, like even if I think of myself, I'm much more likely to walk into a cafe if I see that we accept Visa sign or we accept laser payments, whatever. Because it's an awful, you know, oh God, do I have enough cash? Have I got the change on me? So it's really handy if you have it. I think patients see it as an attractive feature. So I would find it very hard to say that any amount of money is necessary to make it worthwhile. Certainly makes great collecting debts easier.
You said
Yeah.
you registered during the speech of poverty.
Yeah.
Did you become stricter then on the child comes back 2 or 3 years later and you're better at charging than 30 again?
Yeah, we are. If they come back within 2 or 3 days, no. But if they come back within 2 weeks, yes. Normally what will happen is if the doctor, say for example if the rash, you know, I'd like to have a look at you again in 2 days, whatever, they'll make the appointment then and there and put no charge in it. But in the event that the patient comes back about a separate complaint or comes back 2 weeks later or something like that, no, we absolutely enforce the 30 € charge again. And we explain that to patients, you know, if they say, oh, it's really good, doing well. It's clear, it's transparent, it's on our board, you know, and the likelihood of having to come back that often. So it is potentially, it's possible someone will pay €6 for 2 visits, 2 weeks apart, yes it is. But the likelihood of that is so small that most of the time kids bounce back, you know, most of the time they end up paying us.
Just so on the visa machine, there is reduced rate of rental.
I think they have. Yeah.
It's 2.5%.
Yeah, and I think
versus 2.5%.
I think that's true. It might be through AIB. And I remember we were with Bank of Ireland, and I actually rang Bank of Ireland and said, if you don't give me that, I'm moving. And of course, they put it straight on it. So, had them. And insist that you get it because it's amazing. And there's other ones. I mean, check your phone bill, because I found one of our most expensive phone items every month was the credit card machine dialing in to take payment. But every time that phone call was being made, it was racking up a phone charge for me. And it was one of my top 10 items on my phone bill. So again, I rang and I said, look, I'm not happy with this. I don't want to pay so much for my terminal and so much for my percentage and so much for my phone bill. And they said, oh yeah, well we actually do have a free phone number which I'd ask to transfer to it. I said, well, transfer me. And the phone was gone. So ask and look, because unfortunately they'll tell you these things about their contact. So my last tip really, don't let that spiral, because it's like they're much harder to chase. The older they get, the harder they are to chase, and the less likely you are to get them, and the more likely you are to rack up annoyance from people. And that's really not what I meant about it. So whether you charge before the patient goes in, whether you charge after the patient goes in, whether you're very softly or whether you're straight up front about it, I think no matter what you do, if you start to see that spiral and deal with it, give the patient a ring and just say, look, I noticed that the last consultation or 2 consultations are still outstanding. I'm just wondering, is there anything I can do to help? Can I point you by way of getting a medical card if your circumstances are changed? You know, maybe it's a temporary situation, you need to just be aware of that. If there's nothing to file, you can make an agreement that it will be paid by X date. If it's a temporary thing, but just had a really bad month, something happened, or you were away on holidays and you overspent, or whatever, well, you can deal with that. But what you don't know, you can't deal with. So I think if you make the call, make it early, and follow up then with a phone call if what was originally agreed doesn't happen. Okay, so making savings then. Once we've brought in all the income we possibly can, the next step is to try and control our expenditure. And what I would say about this is, look, everybody should have their income expenditure report, as I said, and I think on that, you have to be careful to itemise what your expenditure is so that you can analyse it, because what we can't measure, we can't affect. So check your expenditure carefully. Check your stock. See, do you really need these items? If you're spending so much money on headed paper, do you really need that headed paper, or is it going out of date and your doctors have changed and you're throwing it in the bin? Have you pills and potions stocked away in a cupboard that are now out of date? You know, I've found practices where they're selling things like food supplements or whatever, and I mean, they can be years out of date, and somebody paid a fortune for them, and that's just money down the drain. So check your stock and see are you actually using things. Get a range of quotes when you're ordering. Make sure that you get a range of quotes, particularly for items which are either consumable that you reorder again and again and again, or for major spends. So if you're buying a server or couch or something like that, you might want to shop around. Whereas if you're buying something as a one-off small thing, it may not be so critical to pursue to the end. Think about the length of time you're going to spend getting the quotes and see is it worth it. Time is money, so don't waste time in order to make small savings. Do make savings on things that you either buy regularly or on expensive items. And just to have a general idea of whether your suppliers are overall good value or bad value. Now, a hot topic I suppose at the moment is staff costs. Because when you do look at your expenditure report, one of the items that's going to be very high up your agenda, if not top of your agenda, is wage costs. And I know that a lot of GPs are in a quandary saying, what will I do about that? And I would say that it's an area which can really backfire on people. There are some options. Obviously, I suppose you might be in a situation if your practice is downsizing where you would potentially have redundancies, or you might ask and find that somebody wants to actually take a voluntary redundancy. But in general, I would say that redundancy is a really dangerous idea because the vast majority of people do not want to be made redundant, and it's an option, I suppose, but it's extremely unpopular with staff, so I really don't recommend you go down that route. If you must, get sound legal advice, get sound accounting advice, and talk to your staff whatever step along the way, but it would be my absolute last resort. Preferable to that, but still bad, is pay cuts or pay freezes. And I think a lot of practices have had to bring in pay freezes at least in order to try and stabilise their expenditure. And I think that this is not the worst option because staff usually understand where you're coming from. Again, if you're fairly transparent about how the practice is doing. A lot of the time they've seen colleagues in other industries accept pay freezes, and it can be an acceptable option compared to redundancy. Layoff for short time or people accepting voluntary reductions in their hours might be an option, and that might be a lot more palatable than an across-the-board cut, because you might be able to increase the productivity. A lot of the time people somehow manage to squeeze the job in, even if they've lost an hour or two and get out early on a Friday or come in late on a Tuesday or something like that. So it may be a more palatable option for staff, and they might be willing to up the game for the hours that they're still with you in order to keep their overall hourly rate. Changing of benefits. So, for example, in our practice we had a very lenient sick leave policy, and one of the options that we talked about is whether the staff really wanted to keep the extremely lenient sick leave policy that we had, because it was potentially it would be a very cost for practice if everyone was to take their full sick leave complement, which unfortunately they don't, but it's just one of those areas where it's worth maybe reviewing the policy and see what are they costing it. And recruitment of new employees on less favourable terms. You need to be careful about what they're doing, because obviously that can cause resentment. But on the other hand, I suppose it is an option that if you're bringing somebody in, you may decide to bring them in as a junior receptionist or a junior administrator, and then perhaps negotiate a lesser fee than what people in years before were paid. Personally speaking, I would favour increasing their productivity and making sure that our staff are working at their best rather than cutting things, because I feel cutting tends to inspire a real negative mood within practice, and I think it can actually cost you more in terms of morale and in terms of productivity. And I really can't stress enough how much I've seen from various practices how damaging unilateral cuts can be. I really don't advocate it. You can understand a lot of water. So I would exhaust every avenue of looking at natural wastage and increase productivity first. So I'm going to give you a few examples of, I'm not going to go into big reams of them, but a few small examples where small and regular savings were easily achieved, and I guess one of them, my favourite one's a couch roll, because I've always had a gripe about paying exorbitant fees for couch roll. And at this stage now in our practice we pay $1.91 for couch roll, and I would love to see anyone doing a better fee than that. But that's a nice quality couch roll, it's not horrible. Okay. So those are the types of savings that we try to make in our practice. Definitely things like headed paper. You don't even have to switch supplier. Just shop around and go back to your original supplier saying, look, I can get it for 2.8 cents. Will you do it? Like the credit card machine and the bank wallet saying, look, I'll move to AIB if I have to. But I'm happy to stay with you as long as it's the same rate, and it probably will. So before we move on, is there any questions on finances? Right, well, if you have any questions, we'll come back to chat at the end. People are perhaps the most exciting part of practice. There's also a very heavily legislated part of practice. And all of these different pieces of legislation affect us in terms of general practice. I'm not even going to dream of talking about them all today because we couldn't. I'd rather talk about some of the practical side of things. So the National Employment Rights Authority, if you haven't already heard of them, NERA is their name, and their website is employmentrights.ie. And they are the national body for information both for employers and employees, and they also inspect employers in order to make sure that they're compliant with all of that legislation that was on the previous slide. And they're also good at interpreting that legislation to plain English. So what I would say is, rather than me going through all of the legislation, which would take a year and a half, if you have questions or queries, you have them as a very useful resource, and actually in my experience they're very helpful, and they want to help people to actually achieve compliance rather than being punitive or anything like that. So I would encourage people to actually take up their training events, which are usually free. And if you do have an inspection, don't be afraid of it. It's actually a very positive experience. We've had a NERA inspection. I think we've had nearly everyone inspect us at some point, and the NERA inspection was one of the most useful and the least threatening. It sounds very scary having someone come into your practice and saying, show me everyone's payroll, show me everyone's contract of employment, I'd like to interview two of your staff and find out whether you're doing what you say you're doing. But actually it was a very good experience, and certainly the only feedback really that came to us was they would like us to use an OTW1 form, which is a specific form for recording breaks and things like that. Now, certainly I know a lot of practice would feel that's quite impractical because breaks in general practice can be an ad hoc thing, and you'll get a cup of coffee when you can. So that was the only issue that we had. But I mean, it was really quite an enjoyable experience having them come out and talk to the staff, and made our staff realise how lucky they were that we actually do all the things that we're supposed to do. So don't be afraid of them, they are actually very helpful. So, what types of things are they likely to look for? What are the basics that you should have? So I'll just touch on these. You should have a contract of employment for everybody. You should have proper pay slip detailing the wages that people receive, gross, and any deductions that are made to give the net figure. You should be making sure that you're adhering to the minimum wage requirements. You should be making sure that you are within the working time directive in terms of not more than 48 hours an average week. I think it's unlikely in general practice, but anyone but the partners would do more than that. Breaks, make sure your employees are taking their breaks, make sure they're taking their leave, and make sure that if anyone is leaving you, that they have their minimum notice for dismissal, terminating a fixed term contract or something like that. So that's all of the legislation and where to go if you have a query on the legislation. But in terms of actual practice, I think people are far more complicated than legislation and often want things that don't fit into legislative tick box categories. And I suppose in terms of getting the productivity from our staff, which is what we're here about today, we can talk about efficiencies. We had some great talk earlier from Jack Nagel on basically on lean processes and on eliminating waste. People don't really function like that in my experience anyway. And I think we have to change our mindset when we talk about people, because we're not robots, we don't operate in an efficient manner, but we certainly can operate in a very effective manner, and we can reach out to our patients in ways that make them very happy or very dissatisfied. And I think that's where morale and team spirit and feeling that they have an important role in surgery comes into its own, and that's why I would be wary of fake reasons and redundancies and things like that. So what do they expect from us? Well, they expect us to do the right thing and to do things right. To manage ourselves, to manage the team, and to provide a direction for the team, to facilitate change, to use the resources that we have, and to make sure that we're helping them to use the resources that they have effectively, and ultimately, I suppose, to achieve results for ourselves and for patients. Performance management, we could talk about all day, but I think an awful lot of the mistakes that happen in managing our people stem from misunderstandings and lack of time spent on ourselves and on our team. Because we tend to focus entirely on the patient, and actually practice managers, it's our job often to focus on the team that are focusing on the patient. So the team may not know what's expected of them. That's probably the biggest pitfall, is if they don't know, how can we expect them to do something? So I think for us as practice managers, our main role is communication, making sure that communication happens in the practice. I think it's important to consult with staff and take their views into consideration, because I think one of the big mistakes that happens in any small business is that the manager was seen as the person who makes decisions and just carries them out. And I think in a way we lose a lot of our good suggestions and creativity by not actually engaging sufficiently with our team. Training and coaching and developing people takes time, but it's by doing this that we actually get the best from our people, and certainly the most creative ideas come from people when they feel that they're valued. So we don't just hand over a job, we hand over the responsibility to see it through, and we also hand over the recognition for seeing the job well done. And I think that doing this is actually really vital to engaging the staff fully. So start where your people are. If you haven't done it for a while, consider maybe performance appraisal. An opportunity to sit down with each staff member individually and have a chat about where they're at and where they're going. Ask their opinion, get their opinions on how the practice is doing, where the problems are for them in their role, how did they solve them. And you'll find that mostly it's really they'll solve their own problems if you give them the opportunity. And giving feedback, I think one thing we're afraid of, we can be very afraid of when we deal with people, is to give feedback. People say, oh God, I can't say that to her, she'll cry, or, oh no, she'll take the head off me if I say that. And I think really that's a big mistake, because we have to give feedback if we want things to change. And one of the biggest problems we have is that we're actually making excuses not to tell people when things are not going great. And I think that's probably something we could all do better. It's one of the big things for us as managers is to give that feedback, and to give it without criticism. Yes, it may be critical, maybe it is feedback that people might not like, but you can always tell the difference, I think, in your gut between a person who is giving out to you and a person who is trying to help you. And it's that difference is how we have to make sure that we're trying to help rather than just giving out. Do you know what I'm talking about? You can always tell, can't you, when someone is, oh yeah, sure, going so-and-so, versus, I don't think that's working somehow, how can we fix it? So I think really it's about taking the right stance.
So you're about stepping by staff and different abilities and different abilities to work together. You want to encourage your staff to do.
Well, reward comes in many forms, and I suppose you have to reward people who are doing well, and I think it's an incentive to other people if they see a reward happening. So it could be simply saying thank you. It could be simply saying, you did that really well, and I think the feedback that comes at the time and is genuine means a lot to people. So you don't have to actually hand somebody over a bonus and say that's great, lads, it was fantastic work, and it wasn't. I think if you genuinely work, they'll say, I can't believe how well you dealt with that situation, that could have been a minefield, or how well you diffused that, or because I can't believe Mrs. O'Brien paid her bill, how did you get the money out of her? That's fantastic. Or whatever it is, that you just say it as it comes to you, because that kind of genuine one, thank you, will go a lot further than money actually in a funny way.
How to keep the good people, the dangerous good person is that I want to be harder than me, and I'm tired of it, why should I do it?
Well, I suppose they have to see that if you're not working hard, that you will be taken up on it. And that's one of the problems, one of the real dangers of not addressing poor performance. So if you see somebody's not really pulling their weight, you have to say it to them, And that doesn't mean that you beat them up or make them feel bad, but I think you say, I really need you to be doing that, or, we really need to make sure this is complete, or Jenny seems to be doing all of that, maybe you could help her. So you have to address it.
It's not just not pulling the weight, but just might be able to pull the weight.
Yeah, well I suppose it's very important when you're recruiting that you recruit right, and if you find that you have somebody doing a job who's just not capable, that's a different problem. But I think that a lot of the time poor performance comes down to poor management, and I think it would be much nicer if we could pretend that driving's not very good at it, but the reality is that driving could probably be better than we think. I think we undervalue people a lot, and we say, oh no, sure, we can't ask her to do that, it's not, it's not her skills. It might be their skills, it could become her skills. So try and see employees in terms of their potential rather than where they're at now, and encourage them to see it, because sometimes if you believe in someone, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy and they can improve. Whereas I think if we write them off, we've no chance. So we try and bring them on as far as we can. And I think we have a sense of fairness about people trying hard, because if you see someone beside you is trying really hard, then you're unlikely to feel aggrieved that you're doing better. If you see them really trying, the likelihood is you say, well, she's trying just as hard as I am. Even if my best is better, she's trying just as hard, and therefore you're unlikely to have that lingering resentment of, I do all the work around here, and the rest of them just sit there playing solitaire. And, and that's the type of thing that does make people leave organisations. And, and I think that if a manager is doing their job, then they're making sure that everyone is giving their best, and they will be rewarding people for doing their best. Because you will always have employees with different abilities, but you try and promote up people who have skills, so maybe within your organisation there could come a vacancy someday. Or maybe you recognise that the career path that person has, if they have such vast potential, maybe they'll go on to something else in the future. So I think it's about recognising that life cycle. For example, I have a wonderful girl working with me in Carlton Clinic. She could easily be practice manager. I'm surprised she's still with Carlton Clinic because she could easily be practice manager. And for me, I suppose, having that discussion with her and saying, we need to develop your skills, we need you to be able to do practice management because you could. And someday she might leave, but at the moment, the fact that she feels she's got a real career progression there, and maybe it's a big leap that leaves and she takes the role. So I suppose by engaging people and by being honest with them and by saying, look, I think you have fantastic talents, let's bring them on, wherever that leads us. And that's much more likely to lead to a satisfied employee. And even if they go off and do something else, they come back to it. So again, I had a person who went off travelling the world for 18 months. She came back, she came straight back to us. Is there any chance of a job? I love the clinic. So unfortunately, our staff turnover is practically nothing at Carlton Clinic, which I think is a credit to the practice because people are happy. And if they're happy, they work hard and they have a sense of loyalty to the practice. And they can take an awful lot of anything if they have a good sense of loyalty. So, in our case, we've had pay cuts, which I hate, but it's been enforced on us. And the staff have taken it with great grace, really. And certainly they've all worked harder and longer and better in the last year than they've ever had to do before. And we recently had a meeting, actually, one of the girls said to me, we've never had such good morale. Why? Because we had terrible morale the previous year with pay cuts. That's why I say don't do pay cuts unless you have to. Oh my God, they're the worst thing ever. But the morale is now, better than ever. Why? Because we all know we're in it together. Because we all know that this is what we're facing. And because I suppose people feel that they're playing their role and everyone's playing a role. And people are seeing each other make an effort. And I think people who don't make an effort, if they see them getting told, look, you have to, everyone else is, then it puts that bit of peer pressure and they'll either come on or they'll decide, look, I don't like being here anymore because the culture has changed. So try and make it a culture for your clinic that everyone plays their bit and value people's best because, as you say, people may have different abilities, but if they're doing their best, great. Just to touch on risk, I think I decided to put up this slide about what are the greatest areas of risk in general practice because I would have expected it to be health and safety, trips, slips, falls, fires, chemicals or something like that, and all of those are risks in general practice. But in actual fact, most of the areas where risk occurs are actually in terms of communication and administration. And so I think it's relevant to us as practice managers in particular to be cognizant of the risks in general practice. And this is an MPS study, it's only been very recently published, and I think it's a very useful one because most of us have problems around our communication and our confidentiality. And in terms of risk, I think this is where policies come into their own. We need policies for many things, mostly for creating consistency and for good communication. But I think the policies and systems must be there for the sake of the patient primarily and for the sake of the team. And I think they should be easy to use, they should be easy to understand. If a policy is becoming an obstacle or something that's getting in the way of the practice or getting in the way of the patient, then I think it's time it gets reviewed because policy should be working with you, not against it. Policies should also be, to some extent, I think, they should be flexible. So if you have a case where the policy is one thing, but your common sense is telling you it's not working, then I do think there needs to be some element of flexibility. And I think it needs to be responsive as well to complaints, so you need to review your policies if you feel that they're generating complaint. I thought we'd maybe just take one very brief example, and the amount of text on this slide shows you how detailed the policy could get. This is just about confidentiality, and there's heaps of things you could do about it. You could make this, there's 20 courses about them, just on confidentiality and how to maintain confidentiality. So it's all the obvious things like storing your files safely, making sure not to leave your IT accessible, turning screens away from patients so they can't see you, clearing patient data when you finish the consultation. there's absolute reams of stuff we could talk about. And to be honest with you, that's all fine and well and good when it's written on the shelf and you try and ensure that you adhere to it. But what happens when the policy is momentarily let slip? Maybe somebody overhears something at the reception desk, maybe something happens, that a piece of paper is left out on a table. But I suppose there's a time at which we're all human and policy breaks down. So in this circumstance, what do? And I suppose this is where we may improve on our policies. I'm sure your practices already have policies in place for most of these things, but what do we do or how do we review them? Well, mostly it comes from either complaints or ideally from potential complaints. You don't have to have a real complaint. Just think, how could this go wrong? How could our current situation go wrong? If you do have a situation where you have a complaint, I think the main thing would be empathy and trying to actually get to the bottom of what happened so that you can improve on the policy. So again, just maybe taking confidentiality as a potential type of mistake that could happen, some very simple slip that we made. I think acknowledging that a mistake, an error, a failing has happened is essential. And to try and investigate what's happened. Now, it may not be that a real error has happened. It could be a complete mistake. It could be a fabrication. You wouldn't know until you investigate it. And I think if your investigation does turn out that a mistake, a breach of your policy, or maybe an omission from your policy is identified, then I think it's important to apologise for that and to rectify it and to change your policy. So I think that's where flexibility is essential in terms of putting right the wrong. We try to prevent that risk, but I think when a wrong happens, that's what we do. And even if it turns out that you feel that there's no foundation to the complaint, I think it's probably worth trying to preserve the relationship with almost everybody. Maybe occasionally it breaks down, but by and large, I think we try and give an account of what happened in order to clear up any reason why the patient feels aggrieved, even if there's no substantial aspect to it. Apart from those soft skills like communication and confidentiality and all that, health and safety is a very heavily legislated area. And like with the people skills versus employment law, I'm not going to try and go through all the legislation. I'm just going to put it up there so that people have an awareness of the enormity of what you're facing in terms of legislation as practice managers. We are expected to be aware of it. The main piece of legislation is Safety, Health and Welfare at Work Act, which was updated in 2005, and it's got quite a long list of aspects. The purpose today really is just to touch on it and to draw your awareness to this, that as business managers we're expected to know and to deal with this. So providing safe access to surgery for our staff and for our patients, prevent risks as much as we possibly can in the practice, or to minimise them if we can't eliminate them. To provide suitable facilities for our staff and our patients, provide suitable protective equipment. In other words, to try and prevent accidents from happening, and to make sure that when they do happen, that they're properly investigated and reported. So your practice ought to have a safety statement, the same way as it should have contracts of employment and so on. These should be updated, and I just wanted to draw your attention to, again, like I did with NERA, there is a body for health and safety, the Health and Safety Authority. I'm not going to try and carry out their role. They have a fabulous website, and in particular I would highlight the Be-Smart tools which are on their website, and their website address is hsa.ie or bsmart.ie, and Be-Smart is really super because it will allow you to make up your safety statement there online. It's the HSA's own safety statement that they're producing for you. It's free, so it can actually really do enough of the work for you. And why would you pay somebody for consultancy when the Health and Safety Authority themselves will do it for you? So just to let you know, and that's it. So there are so many concerns in dental practice, and the Be-Smart tool will guide you through them all, from fire, electricity, chemicals, sharps, blood and other bodily fluids, latex allergies, slips and falls, manual handling, ergonomics, use and eye strain, and all the human factors like stress, bullying and so on. So again, all I can really do in the limited time that we have is let you know that they're there, let you know that you should know, and let you know that the information is available free. So that's it. I have some references and some links there, which are all also on your handouts. I'm sorry it's been a whistle-stop tour, but we had a limited time frame to try and touch on an awful lot of aspects. So I'll be here for a while afterwards if anyone has individual questions about their practice or individual employees or individual aspects of health and safety, and I will do my very best to answer them. And if anyone wants to email or get in touch afterwards, please feel free to do. I will always do my best to reply. I would stress I'm only a human being and a practice manager. I am not fully competent in all areas, but I will certainly point you in the right direction and try to help get you an answer if there's a query or a question. And the other thing I would say is that before you leave, do try and at least remember the basics around you today, because I think one of the most useful things that's happened in recent years for practice managers has been simply getting in touch and having a support network there, because it can be a lovely place to be, and I think in the last 2 years we've really discovered that it needn't be at all, and the practice management is coming into its own in terms of an area which is now being recognised, and for that again I'm really grateful to Investment for recognising us. Recognising practice managers and those who are not officially practice managers but who carry out the practice management function. And I think whether you're a secretary, a GP, a nurse, or practice manager, or maybe just someone who's helping out in the practice, if you're participating in that role, there's no reason to feel that you're alone in that or that you don't have the resources at your fingertips. There is an enormous support out there, and I'm just proud to be part of it.